la debilidad del sistema actual. Y entonces os invito a pensar en esta crisis como una oportunidad para seguir implementando alternativas sistémicas desde las bases. Y ahora entramos en el debate bastante interesante de qué es una alternativa, ¿no? Y eso nunca dejará de ser un debate, que está bien porque el sistema también tiene la tendencia de cooptar las prácticas y narrativas radicales de los movimientos y de cómo cooptarles y de en su matriz. Pero para aclarar algunas cosas, en este libro no consideramos alternativas las iniciativas que se encuentran adentro del sistema y que no desafían las estructuras de opresión que he mencionado antes, o sea, el capitalismo, el patriarcado, el racismo, el antropocentrismo, Y digo intentar porque las alternativas no son perfectas, no pueden ser consideradas como perfectas entidades monolíticas, son procesos abiertos con sus tensiones y contradicciones. Y entonces el libro tiene toda una parte que critica las falsas soluciones reformistas como la economía verde, el ecomodernismo, la economía circular, y lo que llamamos alternativas son iniciativas que trabajan hacia la autonomía y la disolución de jerarquías, las prácticas de cuidado y de solidaridad, la armonía y la convivencia respetuosa con la naturaleza, la democracia directa o radical, la justicia social, la autosuficiencia, la diversidad cultural, entre otras cosas. O sea, hay más de 60, creo, diferentes alternativas como el decrecimiento, los comunes, el buen vivir, los feminismos, la economía social y solidaria, las ecociudades, la autonomía zapatista, que son las más conocidas, digamos, pero también hay alternativas que no conocemos, tipo el Kyosei en Japón o el Agatsiro en el norte de África, el Kameza Asaike en el Perú amazónico. Y es bastante interesante porque son, por una parte, tenemos alternativas, pero también hay como prácticas, herramientas concretas como la permacultura, la soberanía energética, la soberanía alimentaria, las monedas alternativas y también corrientes de pensamiento tipo la teología de liberación, el ibadismo, el hinduismo, etc. Y muchas veces estas alternativas son articuladas en aislación, ¿no? Y entonces estamos viendo muchas llamadas a lo que los zapatistas han llamado el pluriverso, o sea, un mundo en el cual muchos mundos quepan. Y es una diferente manera de pensar en la revolución, ¿no? De no plantearnos como un otro sistema como el socialismo, el capitalismo, el comunismo, los ismos, pero de pensar como en la pluralidad y de trabajar con lo que ya existe a nivel local, no porque hay un mogollón de alternativas radicales. Y entonces, para mí, este libro es bastante interesante en el sentido de que es una herramienta linda si se cruzan con personas tipo Thatcher, que os dice que no hay alternativas, o sea, y también son ensayos bastante sencillos y muy accesibles de 1000 palabras, como, y también con bibliografía si quieren entrar como más, bueno, como de manera más profunda en algunas de estas alternativas. Y la construcción de este libro con más de 120 autores también ha sido muy interesante y bastante pluriversal, ¿no? Porque son personas que vienen de países diferentes, con culturas diferentes, de organizaciones políticas diferentes, y entonces como producir este libro también, o sea, ha sido como un proceso, bueno, pluriversal, interesante en el respecto de la diversidad cultural, política, epistemológica y ontológica. Pero eso es solamente el principio, ¿no? Porque el libro este, al final, es un listado de alternativas, que es súper necesario, pero por más que se llama el pluriverso, o sea, no hay un intento de articular estas alternativas juntas en teoría y en práctica. Y entonces, por ejemplo, a través de mi doctorado, estoy tratando de ver cómo podemos crear un diálogo entre todas esas alternativas, ¿no? Y de ver cómo se pueden crear sinergias entre ellas y de ver cuáles son los puntos de tensión, de complementariedad. Y es interesante de ver que cuando ponemos en diálogo esas alternativas, hay como las fortalezas de algunas pueden compensar las debilidades de otras, etcétera. Y también estoy tratando de reflexionar con procesos de articulación de alternativas en los cuales estoy militando, porque el pluriverso, la idea del pluriverso es súper linda, ¿no? Un mundo en el cual muchos mundos quepan, pero ¿qué mundos? ¿Cómo quepan? ¿Quién les hace quepar? ¿Quepar en qué? O sea, hay muchos desafíos cuando te planteas, ¿no? De articular estas alternativas que son tan diferentes sin reproducir como las mismas dinámicas de poder del sistema que estamos criticando. Y entonces, como mi trabajo de militante y de doctorado es de ver cómo podemos fomentar espacios de articulación donde las alternativas del sur global y del norte global tienen las mismas oportunidades de ser escuchadas, visibilizadas y articuladas, y de construir procesos coherentes con los mundos anticapitalistas, antirracistas, antipatriarcales y ecológicos que estamos intentando de construir, ¿no? Y entonces, después de 3 años de cocinando estas ideas del pluriverso, etcétera, el año pasado, con algunos de los autores del libro, hemos lanzado oficialmente un proceso en mayo de 2019 que hemos llamado el tejido global de alternativas. Y en la edición inglés del libro también hay una entrada sobre esto, pero en español lamentablemente creo que no. Y el tejido global de alternativas es un proceso que intenta de identificar, documentar y conectar alternativas a través del mundo y de crear redes de solidaridad y alianzas estratégicas a niveles locales, globales y regionales, perdona. Y se basa en confluencias nacionales de alternativas que ya existen, como en India hay un proceso que se llama Vikalp Sangam, que en hindi significa confluencias de alternativas, y ya han documentado como 1.300 alternativas y tienen como estos espacios así de intercambio. Y también hay otro proceso en México que se llama crianza mutua, que está haciendo como básicamente lo mismo. Y el tejido global de alternativas trata de ver cómo podemos multiplicar estos espacios de alternativas, de confluencias de alternativas y de entretejerles, ¿no? Entonces tenemos hoy un proceso interesante de cartografía de las alternativas que existen a través del mundo y decir, bueno, en esta región hay como mogollón de alternativas. ¿Por qué no abrimos un espacio donde toda esta gente increíble se puede encontrar y ver qué surge de estos espacios, ¿no? Y a veces no surge nada, pero a veces como hay necesidades como de crear alianzas estratégicas entre grupos y alternativas, y eso es la idea muy linda, es que cada confluencia de alternativas se autodefine cómo quiere trabajar, qué necesita, etcétera. Y el tejido global de alternativas en ese sentido no tiene estructura central de poder ni mecanismos de control. Sus estructuras son diversas, ligeras, horizontales, democráticas, inclusivas y descentralizadas, y utiliza también diversas maneras como de comunicar, diferentes idiomas, etcétera. Y es interesante que se difunde así como paso a paso, como un conjunto muy complejo de tejidos en constante expansión, hasta que, no sé, una masa crítica de alternativas puede crear las condiciones para los cambios sistémicos que necesitamos. Y entonces, como lo dije antes, como la idea del pluriverso, es bastante interesante como replantearse la idea de qué es una revolución, ¿no? Porque con el tejido global, por ejemplo, lo que estamos planteando es que un mundo en el cual muchos mundos quepan significaría que al final el capitalismo se volverá una opción dentro de una pluralidad de opciones y progresivamente desaparecerá. Bueno, en teoría, en la práctica no sé, veremos. Pero nada, si queréis, quiero dejar la palabra quizás a Alyosha, que nos pueda hablar un poco más de... Y así dejamos un poco más tiempo para el debate, porque como la Asamblea Ecologista de la OAB y otras personas, me gustaría saber lo que piensan del tema de... Bueno, así que muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Yo creo que a lo mejor que hablamos sobre la contribución de Marta antes, porque tiene que irse a las 2. Y bueno, si me dejas la palabra, probablemente voy a hablar los siguientes 20 minutos y no nos quedarán tiempo para discutirlo, pues no sé, yo prefiero que...
¿Hay preguntas?
Punto del contexto de tu libro, y quiero agradecer mucho porque lo que mostráis en su libro y con la contribución de otros distintos futuros es que no hay solo un futuro, no hay solo una historia posible. Hay otros mundos que los podemos imaginar, y no solo imaginar, pero hay otros mundos que han vivido y están viviendo la gente por todos los sitios. Y cuando pensamos de historia, podemos pensar que eran otras historias posibles, menos trágicas, con menos violencia, con menos extinciones, destrucción de la naturaleza. Y me daba mucha motivación para que pienso que no vamos a dejar que la gente que son la causa de crisis ecológica escribe nuestra historia y que hay otros distintos pensamientos de historia. Vale, si alguien más quiere hablar de su libro particular o de Pluriverse, os dejo la palabra. Si no, yo tampoco tengo una contribución de 15 o 20 minutos.
No, nada, o sea, me parece más lógico, o sea, hacer la contribución y luego generar el debate a raíz de la contribución, o sea, de todo lo que se ha dicho. Entonces, y al final ya eso, que ya lo extiendes hasta donde queramos. O sea,
Vale, pues,
si queréis,
pues sigo, pero tengo que disculparme porque no estoy acostumbrado a hablar de estas cosas en castellano. Claro que podemos discutir en castellano, pero prefiero usar inglés. Pues si no entienden alguna parte de mi contribución, puedo explicar, pero voy a hablar en inglés. So, what I want to do in my contribution today is actually three things. First, I just want to amplify why we are already in a crisis, ecological crisis. Why the framings that ecological crisis is something around the corner and that we have to act now to stop it is probably not the best way of framing the problem, because we already live in this problem. And then I'm going to talk about the drivers, like what are the main causes of the problem, more from a natural science perspective. And finally, I'm going to talk about these mainstream solutions, which Marta also referred to as false solutions, soluciones falsas, to maybe try to deconstruct them and to come up with a different viewing of the problem, and also different kind of solutions, not the mainstream solutions, which are in the sense of we can change everything, we just need to trust in the technology and do some little tweaks in the policy and everything's gonna be alright, we got this, we can solve the problem. No, I think it's not that simple. And then finally, maybe if I still have some time, I will talk about the context of UAB and like the micro scale of solutions, so at the level of community and university and so forth. So what I would like to start with is that this narrative that, well, we need to do something if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, and we need to do it now, is to some degree true, because we do need to change fundamentally certain systems, aspects of our society. But on the other hand, it also undermines that we are already living in an ecological crisis. And first part, I would just like to say why I think we already live in the ecological crisis. There's a general consensus that we live in the time of the sixth mass extinction. It's called also the Holocene extinction. And it's a mass extinction because, contrary to like a natural rates of extinction, which are around like 2 to 10 species a year, every year right now more than 50,000 animal and plant species are extinct, like they don't exist. They're part of the history. So this is fact number one. The second fact number one, why we already do live in ecological crisis, is because if you look since the beginning of the 20th century, more than 80% of wild land animals have been lost. So more than 80% of animals that have populated the savannas of Africa as well as forests in Europe don't exist anymore. What we have is a very small proportion of 20% of what used to be the wild animals. And if we put this into the perspective of how much animals actually are in the world, we see that less than 4% of biomass, so 4% of like the weight, peso, de los animales, are still wild animals. Like more than 60% of total mass of animals are actually wild animals that are used for consumption, for meat and dairy and so forth. And the other 30% are humans. So we have, what I want to say with these two facts is that we have significantly altered, changed the relationship between what used to be society before the Industrial Revolution, when we were part of a nature, significant share, but now where we really dominated and nature is just like a footnote of the system that we live in. The third reason why I think, and why I'm really concerned about the crisis, is because of the impacts it has on human societies. So I try to approach it both looking at the animals but also to human systems. So you might not know, but in 2018, around 25 million people around the world were refugees, were forced from their homes, either internally within a region or had to look for homes somewhere else. So 25 million of refugees around the world. And this is like a really dominating political issue that's like surging up the far right, eco-fascism, also other forms of fascism in Europe, Spain, we recently see it. So it's a big problem. It can have transformative consequences, and it already has it in our countries. But when we talk about climate change, we know that by the middle of the century, so 30 years, there's going to be between 150 and 300 million climate refugees. The people who is going to run away from the surge of water and also other environmental hubris. So high temperatures, heat waves, and so forth. So how are we going to cope with 200 million refugees when we see that already 25 million is something that seems unimaginable, and the only way people can think of dealing with it is like building up walls. So this is like a serious concern for me, and this is why I think we are living in the ecological crisis that we need to address right now. Like finally, and maybe like most important for the majority of people, but not for us here, is to talk about the economy. No? I mean, I don't really care about this that much, but economists assume that if we don't avoid catastrophic climate change in 21st century, there's going to be about 4% of GDP every year that we'll have to pay to cope with the damages. So that means that, and that's a huge burden. I mean, when we talk about alleviating people from poverty, there seems to be a fiscal rule that prevents doing it when we talk about the order of 1% of GDP. It's unimaginable to now, like, for the politicians to invest 1% of GDP for social housing, for example. So how are we going to do within this system 4%? Obviously, it's going to affect some people more than others, and people are going to suffer a lot. So these are the reasons why I think we are in ecological crisis, and it's really serious, and we have to do something about it. What are the drivers of this crisis? Like, I think it's quite easy to understand if we just look at what's happened in the 20th century in contrast to what has been happening in the human history before then. And 20th century is specific, as John Robert Menil, environmental historian, says, because it's a century of the Great Acceleration. So he uses this terminology, the Great Acceleration. And the Great Acceleration means that basically all the impacts the humans have on the nature have amplified exponentially. They have really grown out of control. Historically, populations have been more or less stable in terms of their impact on the environment, or linear. That means that with the growth of human population, economic activity, and so forth, the impacts have been linear. In the last century, they have been increasing exponentially. This means that since 1950s, for example, population has increased by 3.5 times. So 450% of population that we had 70 years ago. The GDP has increased 12 times, so 1,200% increase. Energy use 5 times, and CO2 emissions, which are the main cause of climate crisis, have increased by 8 times. So in a very short geologically speaking time of a couple of decades, we have really increased our impact significantly. And this is the reason why, contrary to the 19th century, where we could see some animals being extinct because of hunting, removal of forests, and so forth, now we have a wicked problem where animals go extinct because we have an overall presence in the world, and we have altered the oceanic systems, the climate systems, and all other ecological systems. So this is, I want to amplify that there is some urgency in this, right? But the urgency isn't around the corner in 2030, while the climate change is going to hit the worst. No, like, we already live in a very degraded world full of waste and suffering. So the climate crisis is happening now, and that's why we really have to change it quickly. So what do the climate models tells us? What do they tell us about how we can cope with these problems? So as you know, in the Paris Agreement, there's the ambition that we reduce or limit global warming between 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And right now we are above 1 degree Celsius. Physically speaking, it's almost impossible to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius because we have already put a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere and there is like a time lag, so a shift between when you put CO2 in the atmosphere and when you have a temperature response. But the best case is we can cope with 1.5. What we would have to do? We would have to cut global emissions, carbon emissions by half, so by 50% in 10 years, by 2030, and then become carbon neutral, so like not emit any CO2 that wouldn't be offset by 2050. So basically in the next decade or 2 decades, we will basically have to stop using fossil fuels and change them with other sources of energy production. And this is a huge technological challenge, obviously. And it's especially a huge technological challenge within the context where we keep believing that we can grow our economy and our consumption. Because there's a connection between how much we create, produce, economy, and how much materials we use and how much energy we use. Historically, in the last 10 decades, when economy has become a bit more efficient, for every % of GDP growth, energy use grows by 0.5%. So the problem that we have is we want to continue growing energy and material use, but on the other hand, we want to change the way of producing energy from fossil fuels to renewable systems. And there are some technological problems. I will first just speak about technology because I think that's the most comfortable thing also to discuss with people who don't think about climate change as we with Marta do, for example. So I think the problem with renewable energy here is that we don't only have to change the amount of energy we have now with renewables, but on top of that, we also have to build more to provide for the growing energy consumption, right? I mean, and there are some reasonable questions whether do we have the resources to do that? Do we have enough lithium and other rare mineral resources that would be required to build this massive amount of wind power, solar power, and other alternative ways of producing energy? And there's quite some research done that really doubts this, that shows that, well, the known lithium reserves are probably insufficient to do that. Do we have the productive capacity to transform the economy in 10 years? Can we really build like the sufficient amount of factories that are going to change massively the whole energy system? Every single thing we do requires a certain amount of energy. And then finally, do we have the consensus to do it? Because there's a huge impact on the land also from the renewables. Like if you imagine hydropower, you need to basically build a dam for the river, you locally destroy the ecological system, and you might also dispopulate people who live around this because you need to build artificial aquifers, the accumulation zones. And there's also an issue of like colonizing economically other countries, because we know that Bolivia and Chile are basically the only reliable sources of lithium we have, which we will need for renewable energies. So are the people there going to consent into just like completely destroying their natural environment so that the global West as well can have the sufficient amount of electric cars and so forth? So what I want to say is two things. Renewable energy is not perfect, no? Because as any type of energy, it always has certain negative benefits. There is no such thing as clean energy. I mean, this is a universal lie. You always have certain bad impacts. So at the end of the day, you have to make a choice which impacts you're going to make. But this is not just a choice that's my choice, but it's a choice that affects other people. It affects the people in Bolivia. People in Bolivia, as you know, 2 weeks ago, there was a coup against the government. And I don't know if this is a plausible theory, but the thing is that Evo Morales revoked a concession to a German lithium mining company that had a huge allow us to start mining those huge amounts of lithium. So there are a lot of environmental conflicts, resource conflicts that are behind and that also come with any kind of technology. So we have to keep that in mind. What are the mainstream solutions? What did they say? So they say, okay, we need to build renewable energy, and I think I shown that there are many potential problems with renewable energy. I would just like to add that to produce more than 50% of all energy with wind energy, we'll probably have to use 4% of the global land available just to put those wind power. So we are talking about massive transformation of the landscape, and this can also tell you that there's going to be a significant number of wind power farms needed to be produced. We're talking about millions and millions of those wind power plants, as well as for solar power plants. So there's serious doubts whether we can do it. And the only way we can think about not really resolving this problem, the contradictions, right? Not really fixing everything, but about making it more graspable and manageable, is by starting to question this thirst for more and more energy. So smaller the energy system, lower also the impact. If we cut energy by 50%, there's 50% less of wind power plants we need to install. So that's one of the ways we can think about approaching this problem. Okay, what are other mainstream solutions? Replacing gasoline cars with electric cars. No one is talking about, okay, maybe we should just design the transportation differently and like move from one to other place, first of all, less, and second, in a different way. Like cars are probably the most stupid and inefficient way of transporting one person from one to another place, because what you're basically doing is you take a person that weighs, let's say, between 70 and 100 kilos, and you put it in a car of 2 tons, so 2,000 kilos, and of course you need a lot of energy to move this person and also the car that weighs like 40 times more than a person, no? From one place to another. And moreover, you need huge infrastructure, you need to build a lot of roads. When you have a lot of people using the cars, you need even more roads, because otherwise they're stuck in traffic jam and so forth. So mainstream solutions are all about, okay, let's fix it with technology, but let's not start thinking about changing the system and the way we do things, right? And we talk about using energy more efficiently, so to come up with new and innovative devices that will require less energy to do the same service. But no one is talking about what do we need, what kind of services do we actually need. It's just about, okay, we need to be more efficient, not about we need to change also our activities and our wants that we want to do things. So there's the idea that, okay, we need clean energy transformation, investment in research and innovation, and carbon tax. And I think there's a problem with this idea of carbon tax as well, because so basic idea of carbon tax is pollution is bad, but we're not paying for it. So when we introduce carbon tax, we take this into account, we make people pay for it, and because it gets more expensive to pollute, people will do it less. So we're going to cut emissions. And I think to some extent, it's true, like this could definitely work. But then if we take a more holistic perspective of how the world would look like when we introduce carbon tax, we have to look at how much would we actually have to price the carbon. So what would the carbon tax be if we would like to stay under 2 degrees Celsius climate change, for example? And the models show, I don't know if they're right, they probably underestimate, that the carbon tax would have to be from 2020 somewhere in the range of 150 euros per ton of carbon emitted, and then up to 1,000 euros per ton. If we take a look at like an average carbon footprint of a citizen in Spain, it's about 6 tons. So this means at least 1,000 euros immediately from my and your pocket to maybe up to 6,000 euros every year. Like, I personally feel inclined that if I could solve the the global climate change problem and ecological crisis with 1,000 euros, I would definitely like to pay it out of the pocket. But I think it's a big constraint on the people, especially when these prices go up and up. And as a matter of fact, we would have to progressively increase the carbon tax up to more than 1,000 euros in the following decades. So it would become a major problem. What I want to point out here is just that when economists think about crisis, again, they don't think about, okay, maybe people should start doing things differently, maybe we should change the way we produce things, maybe we should change the way we advertise the human needs. No, people are just going to pay for it, and imposes a limit on people, right? Imposes a limit, which is, okay, you're going to have to pay 6,000 euros, which is like more than I have to pay for rent in Barcelona, which is crazy expensive, no? But still is a lot. Rather, instead of like putting limit on something else, which is like the amount of things we have to use. So it's a different kind of limit, right? And the final point I want to talk about is actually limits, because this is what my research group, ICTA, is about. Like, we think about environmental crisis within the context of we have to limit our behavior, we have to limit our impacts on this planet. So that's why we talk about degrowth. We talk about degrowth because we see this tendency that impacts, the bads, natural bads, are connected with the scale, with the growth of how much energy, materials, and how much economy grows in the future. So we say, no, like, it's not just about fixing with technology. We should rather limit ourselves. But I want to emphasize that this limit is not about give yourself an additional limit to what you have in this system. It's a different kind of limit, because this system continuously puts limits on us, right? I mean, the limit for my well-being is, for example, I have to pay more than 6,000 euros per year for a shitty flat in Gracia that doesn't have even heating. Like, I mean, this is incredible. Like, I come from Slovenia. We were in Yugoslavia like some decades ago together with Marta. And for us, this was unimaginable, because we all have heating, and we also all had social housing. Like, housing was basically free. So what I want to say is there already are some limits that always exist within a system, and it's the type of limits that we want to oppose on ourselves that's different. We have let other people write our history, right? In terms of inequality in Spain, in terms of who owns the housing, and what we are expected to do. We are expected to pay for a shitty apartment 6,000 years, and we accept it because these are the rules of the game. What we want to change is rules of the game. And the rules of the game we want to change is that we want to have decent social housing for everyone, as a right, for example, but on the other hand, we can limit something else, something more meaningful. Not meaningless limit to pay for the social housing, but a meaningful limit to limit the amount of energy I'm going to consume, to limit how much flights I want to take every year, to limit what kind of things I want to buy every year. And I think in that way we can think about more meaningful life in for us, but a different kind of life that is also going to be consistent with ecological limits and will maybe stop this disastrous acceleration that we have seen. So, yeah, this is all. Oh yeah, what about, okay. So like with UAB I get really pissed actually, because on Monday, so yesterday, I got this email that UAB has tried to reduce the pollution, so now we can buy, apparently in Abascus, I think, these water bottles, so that we don't have to use the, I don't know, plastic ones, or buy the plastic bottles on the vending machine. I think it's like, wow. So UAB has declared emergencia climática, no? And now they invented a water bottle. So now we can buy it here as well. It's like,
solve the climate crisis.
I mean, on the other hand, like, it's just incredible, because they changed the coffee machine provider, and before in ICTA we demanded that they phase out all the single-use plastics from the coffee machines at ICTA, and they did it. So we had the wooden sticks and the paper cups, and that was one step forward, no? But now they changed the coffee provider, and we are again with this shitty plastic. So like, yeah, I really don't get this greenwashing shit that UAB is doing. I mean, what I think UAB has to do is to bust this kind of ecological myths that we as individuals can solve the problem by buying water bottles and like reusing plastics and like recycle, because I mean, it's full of crap and everyone knows it. And then actually put some kind of limits on how much resources UAB uses, both in terms of, yeah, you can start with plastic because it's the easiest thing to do. You just have to ban it. But then also in terms of how much UAB as a whole travels, because right now there is absolutely no restriction, and people can go to Madrid taking a flight for 20 euros and they can see this is, you know, acceptable. And then for me, it's not acceptable to say we have a climate emergency and allow this kind of things to happen. I think there should be a redefinition and imposition of limits at the central UAB level if we want to lead by example, to say how much are we going to reduce the carbon footprint, the material footprint in the next years, and then develop policies that are going to enforce it to do so, because otherwise declaring climate emergency is meaningless. It's actually worse than not declaring it, because you give the impression that you're confronting the problem, that you're doing something about it, while you're just letting the things go their own way as they were before. And for me, this is worse, to pretend that you are solving something and lie about it, than accept that you're not doing something because you're not capable of. You know, I think these are not the only choices. We have to do something. We have to limit UAB, and yeah, I mean, let's do that.
Que digo que hace poco se hizo, creo, una jornada en el ICTA sobre si hacía falta que los investigadores e investigadoras del ICTA viajaran tanto. Me suena que hubo alguna jornada así, no sé si estuvisteis ahí y si podéis hablar un poco de qué se habló, porque realmente es eso, ¿no? La UAB ha declarado emergencia climática, pero yo, por ejemplo, estoy metido en el huerto. Aquí tenemos un huerto autogestionado y nos han echado. O sea, emergencia climática, pues acciones realmente no están haciendo, ¿no? Entonces eso, preguntaros un poco qué se habló en esa jornada en la que se cuestionaba todos los viajes que se hacen por temas de investigación en el ICTA.
Bueno, sí que teníamos esta jornada, yo también estuve allí. Y bueno, hemos hablado cómo podríamos, como nuestro instituto, con algunas propuestas concretas, contribuir para alimentar, para ayudar con algunas propuestas concretas, cómo podríamos reducir el impacto. Y nuestro focus era los viajes con vuelos. Y sí, habíamos propuesto algunas medidas. Por ejemplo, habíamos proponiendo que Corte Inglés, que maneja todos los viajes de los investigadores, impone algunas reglas cuando... Sí, es una putada. Yo los...
Más que una putada, es incoherente.
Sí, claro. Pero vale, empezamos dentro de del sistema que tenemos, ¿no? Que ellos imponen algún regulamiento sobre cuándo se pueden usar los vuelos, y que también los proyectos, cuando se renovan en todas las instituciones de UAB, tienen algún presupuesto y algún límite cuánto podrían volar los investigadores. Y que siempre, cuando hay alguna alternativa con el bus o el tren, que no es mucho más caro. Por ejemplo, hablamos de las distancias que son dentro de 6 horas con tren, se tiene que coger el tren. Aquí, así que se impone alguna regulativa, que son las excepciones cuando se permita los trenes. Y esto no era solo nuestra idea, pero hay ideas que ya están funcionando en algunas universidades de la Europa. Pues esto eran nuestras propuestas. Nosotros hemos enviado el documento con concretas medidas a la institución, y así, a ver qué nos dicen. Yo no tengo mucha confianza que van a cambiar, porque lo van a ver como demasiado fuerte, pero bueno, intentamos por todas las fronteras.
Vale.
Antes, o sea, dentro del pluriverso, o sea, has hablado un poco del concepto de pluriverso y has presentado el libro. Y también has dicho que no todas las propuestas o sea, te las has leído, porque ha habido, creo que 120 investigadores, ¿no? Pero interpreto que algunas de las propuestas sí que las habéis escrito o trabajado vosotras. Y no sé si podrías hacer una breve descripción de algunas de esas propuestas, si nos queda tiempo o si queréis. O sea, aunque sea un minuto por propuesta. Bueno, o sea, lo que queráis, pero, o sea, que tampoco os suponga demasiado esfuerzo y todo eso. ¿Parece bien? Sí, las que creáis que son más interesantes o más que aportan más al concepto de pluriverso.
Para mí está clarísimo que la propuesta que tiene más sentido en articular el pluriverso es esto lo que hay que ver con los feminismos, básicamente, porque por su transversalidad, su internacionalismo, y bueno, cuando digo los feminismos no son los feminismos blancos, europeos, etcétera, sino que más los feminismos descoloniales, ¿no? Que también plantean esta cosa de interseccionalidad, y entonces cuando hablamos de alternativas al capitalismo se entiende también alternativas al racismo, al patriarcado, al antropocentrismo, que también ponen la vida en el centro, y en ese sentido como todas las prácticas de cuidado y de sostenibilidad de la vida, etcétera, que nos permiten también como pensar como básicamente que el pluriverso no será, o sea, tiene que ser feminista, ¿no? Y porque las otras cosas, bueno, son como propuestas que tienen un anclaje muy territorial, pero creo que lo que es súper interesante con los feminismos es que, bueno, tienes una matriz así como en el mundo entero, y son los movimientos que tienen más potencia ahora, creo. Y entonces, bueno, si yo tendría que, de hecho, en mi doctorado, por ejemplo, yo estoy tratando de ver cómo se puede, ¿cómo se dice? Approach, como
Acercar.
ya, ¿cómo podemos pensar el pluriverso como desde una mirada feminista decolonial? Porque muchas veces porque ahora el pluriverso se está volviendo un poco más como fashion, ¿no? Como hay una cerveza que se llama el pluriverso, hay como, no, es una, no sé, y es parte del proceso de cooptación del cual hablé antes. Es como tienes como más y más personas que están como interesados en el pluriverso y dicen, bueno, hay mogollón de alternativas a través del mundo, ¿por qué no crear un sistema de todas esas alternativas, que no es el punto del pluriverso? Entonces, si estamos pensando en una manera coherente de articular un pluriverso, tiene que ser desde la diversidad y no de crear un sistema así como que es una cosa muy colonial, creo. Y entonces, por eso yo estoy tratando de ver cómo los feminismos descoloniales nos pueden ayudar a construir ese pluriverso. No sé si, Alyosha, quieres incluir algo, porque también, bueno, otra cosa es que cuando estoy hablando de articular estas alternativas juntas y que las debilidades de algunas alternativas pueden ser compensadas por las ventajas de otras, es que cuando, por ejemplo, hablamos del buen vivir en América Latina, que trata de, no sé, como de vivir más en armonía con la naturaleza, es una crítica al consumerismo de Europa y del occidente y del capitalismo y todo. O sea, olvidamos también que, por ejemplo, en sociedades indígenas también, o sea, hay problemas del patriarcado. Y entonces, cuando